Hey there. We're going to be looking at finding an endpoint when you've been given a midpoint and the other endpoint of a line segment. So hopefully you've already watched the first part of these videos, which talks about the midpoint formula. If you haven't, or if you just want a quick refresh, here's how it works. The midpoint formula says if I have two endpoints, one of them the coordinates are x1 and y1, and the second one the coordinates are x2 and y2. The way I find the midpoint of those 2 points, the point that would be perfectly halfway between my endpoints, is I do my x's added together and divided by 2, which is the same as averaging your x's. That gives you the x coordinate of your midpoint. And then same thing for my y's. To get the y coordinate of my midpoint, I average the y coordinates of my 2 endpoints. So when we are given 2 endpoints, what we've done before is found the midpoint. I had you do that in Desmos just because it was something that was very easy to just quickly do in Desmos, have Desmos do the calculation for us. Today, however, we are going to be working a little backwards. So for this problem, I'm going to read through it and then kind of draw a picture of what's going on, but then we'll actually do it. You don't actually need to draw a picture for these, I just want to give you a mental image. So the midpoint of line segment TU is M24, and one endpoint is T11. I'm going to draw a quick little coordinate plane here. M, my midpoint, is at 2, 4. So right about there. This would be M. And then one endpoint of my line segment is 1, 1. And that endpoint is called T. They want us to find U, which is probably going to be somewhere up here if this is halfway through. We would be continuing up here. They want us to find the coordinates of that. You could do this with some careful counting, but it gets pretty difficult, like especially if you have fractions or decimals involved. So the best way to do this is to use the midpoint formula, but a little differently than we've used it before. So, first thing we're going to do is we're going to find the x coordinate of our midpoint. And the way we do that is we are going to use this right here. So our midpoint x is equal to what I did here. x1 plus x2 divided by 2. Okay? Before we get too carried away, let's label what we know. The x coordinate of my midpoint is what I'm calling midpoint x. And that's this right here, which is 1. And then since they've given us one of the coordinates, they've given us, I'm sorry, I did on the wrong point. T is not my midpoint. M is my midpoint, so pretend I didn't do that. M is my midpoint, so this right here is the x coordinate of my midpoint. I'm calling that midpoint x, just to kind of shorten it a little bit. Let's label what else we know. We know one x coordinate and one y coordinate of an endpoint, so let's call this x1. We'll get back to the y's here in a second. Actually, let's do the y's right now. The y coordinate of my midpoint is 4, so I'm going to call that midpoint y. And then if this is x1, the y coordinate goes with it is y1. So y1 is also 1. Let's plug things that we know in our formula. Our midpoint x, we know from when we labeled that, our midpoint x coordinate was 2. Let's see what else we know. Do we know x1? Yes, we do. x1 is 1. Do we have an x2? We do not, so we're just going to call that x2 for now. And then divided by 2 is just part of our formula, so we're going to keep it like that. From here, we can solve this equation. What we need to do is we need to get x2 by itself. So we need to undo everything that's happened to x2. This looks like the 2 steps equations we did a while ago. I need to first undo everything being divided by 2 by multiplying both sides by 2. Cancels here. 2 times 4, 2 is 4. And then one last step. We need to get x2 completely by itself. So I subtract the 1 to get rid of that 1 plus. 4 minus 1 is 3. So I get that x2 is 3. So that's going to be the x coordinate of my other endpoint u. We're going to do the same, well, a very similar process. What we're going to do now is we're going to find y. We're going to do this very similarly. Now we're looking at the y part of the midpoint. We know that the y-coordinate of our midpoint, or midpoint y, is equal to y1 plus y2 all divided by 2. Let's fill in what we know. The midpoint of the y-coordinate of my midpoint is 4, so that goes here. y1, we know that is 1. y2 we don't know, so just leave that as y2, and then divided by 2 doesn't change. Once again, from here we need to solve. So we need to get y2 by itself. It's going to be very similar steps. Undo this dividing by 2 by multiplying both sides by 2. Cancels here. 2 times 4 is 8. And then our very last step to get y2 by itself, so we need to undo 1 plus, so we subtract 1. So I end up with 7 for my y2. We have the things we need, we just need to write our final answer. They're asking us for coordinates here. So the coordinates of endpoint U, the other endpoint, are going to be my x coordinate, which was 3, my y coordinate, which is 7. So that right there answers our question. And if you kind of visualize it here, here's where U would be, M is halfway between, as long as I made my graph correctly. Let's go ahead and try one more like this. Again, it's using a midpoint formula, but just a little bit differently. Let me fix what we need to fix. So this time, we're going to be talking about line segment VW. Not a Volkswagen, I promise. The midpoint of line segment VW is M for -1. And its endpoint is, one of its endpoints is W -2, 0. We want to find the coordinates of our other endpoint, which since we know W, the other endpoint is V. Same exact process, we're just going to do a little bit more practice with what we just did. So, think back. Let's start by labeling things. That's how I did things kind of before. They've given us our midpoint. So 4 is the x coordinate of my midpoint. And -1 is the y coordinates of my midpoint. And then they've given us one of our endpoints. Let's just call that endpoint x1 and y1. And so the x coordinate of my endpoint is -2. We'll call that x1. The y coordinate of my endpoint is 0. I'll call that y1. So from here, we're trying to find the coordinates of our other endpoint. Since we are using our other endpoint, we have to work backwards from our midpoint like we did before. Let's start by finding x. So when we are dealing with the x coordinate of a midpoint and an endpoint, we use the x part of the midpoint formula. We know that the midpoint x is going to equal x1 plus x2, all divided by 2. Now let's sub in what we know. Midpoint x is 4, x1, dropping stuff, I'll get that in a second. X1 is the x coordinate of the endpoint they gave me, so -2. I do not know x2, so I'm going to leave that blank, that's what we're trying to find. And then 2 divided by doesn't change. From here we know we need to solve. So solve the equation we're left with. Get rid of that divided by 2 first by multiplying by 2. 2 times 4 is 8. 2's cancel over here. And then last but not least, to get rid of -2, I do the opposite, which is add 2. Cancels here, which is what I want. I get that x2 equals 10. So that'll be part of the coordinates of my endpoint. Now I need to find the y coordinate. To get my y coordinate, now using the y part of our midpoint formula. We know that the midpoint of the y coordinate of our midpoint is equal to the y stuff in the midpoint formula. y1 plus y2 divided by 2. Do we know midpoint y? Yes, we do. It's -1. Do we know y1? Yes, we do. It is 0. Do we know y2? No, we don't. That stays y2. And then divided by 2 stays the same. Now we solve. So first of all, undo that dividing by 2 by multiplying by 2 on both sides. 2 times -1 is -2. These cancel on the other side. And then you could think about this one of 2 different ways. You could subtract 0 from both sides. That would be fine. Or you can just think 0 plus y2 is the same thing as y2. So I didn't actually have to do any more work there because it was a 0. If you would have subtracted 0, -2 minus 0 is still -2, so it still works. I have everything I need. I just need to write my answer as coordinates. So the coordinates of endpoint B are x coordinate is 10, y coordinate is -2. Remember, it's always x then y, just like in the alphabet. So that is how you find a missing endpoint if you have a midpoint and the other endpoint. Let me know if you have any questions. I hope you have a wonderful day.